Back in 2017, I made a video where I gave an overview of this 1992 Iowa linear recumbent bike, which I had just recently purchased at the time. I've now owned this bike for about 2.5 years, and in this video, I'm going to give an update on it and also show some things that I've changed on the bike in the time that I've owned it. So back in the summer of 2017, this bike was my primary vehicle, and in the first 4 months that I owned it, I rode it back and forth to work nearly every day. It was the most comfortable bike I'd ever ridden, and I really loved it. Unfortunately, however, after one summer and a few thousand kilometers ridden, I discovered a small fatigue crack had started to form on the right rear frame arm where it meets the main frame tube. Sadly, this is a common issue with these old Iowa-built bikes, and it's something that's acknowledged on the Linear website. So when I noticed the crack, I stopped riding the bike and started brainstorming ways that I might be able to repair it. In the meantime, however, I bought a newer Linear which was made in about 2005, which I later upgraded to an even newer frame. So the newer bike took over as my primary vehicle, but all the while I still had this old 1992 bike with a tiny crack in the frame which prevented it from being ridden. I considered putting this bike up for sale as a project for somebody else to worry about fixing, but in the end I just decided to tackle the project myself. So from Linear I purchased this U-shaped aluminum plate which is designed to be welded onto an Iowa Linear's rear frame as an upgrade to stiffen it up and mitigate the fatigue problem. After several emails and phone calls, I was able to find a welding shop in my city who was willing to do this aluminum welding job for me. The aluminum frame has an anodized gold covering, but in preparation for the welding I had to remove some of it, which gave the bike a pretty strange appearance. Getting the frame re-anodized would have been difficult and probably very expensive, but I managed to find some gold metallic spray paint which was practically an exact match. So here you can see the rear frame of the bike with the reinforcing U-plate welded on, and everything painted to match the rest of the frame color. Unfortunately, however, the paint isn't as durable as the anodizing was, so you can see some of it's already started to get scratched off. With the new plate added, the frames become much more rigid, and I can feel that it flexes a lot less when riding. Also, the existing crack, which was somewhere around here, has now been bridged together by the plate, so it should no longer be an issue. As it turned out, though, the frame wasn't the only thing on the bike which needed to be fixed. Earlier in the year I had actually borrowed the seat from this bike to use on my other Linear, and unfortunately one of the welds which is holding it together failed. I've actually had quite a few issues with the welds on these old Iowa Linear seats failing, so when this happened I wasn't very keen on getting it re-welded. Instead I decided to attempt to repair it using fasteners instead of welds. So the first step was to remove the old seat bottom from the seat frame. To determine the shape I would need for the replacement part, I made a cardboard template and traced it onto the new aluminum plate. I decided to go with thicker gauge aluminum than the existing because I figure that'll be better for being bolted on. I cut the shape out on my wood cutting bandsaw, which works surprisingly well. My design for the seat bottom have these two tabs which fold and are bolted to the front vertical seat supports. The seat bottom is also fastened in place in 3 other places on either side. Since the tubing is aluminum, which is a soft material, I feared that tapping threads into the tubing probably wouldn't have been strong enough to support the load previously supported by the welds. On the other hand, if I tried to fasten the bolt using a nut by drilling holes all the way through both walls of the tubing, I was concerned this might weaken the tubing too much, and also tightening down on those nuts would have had a tendency to collapse the round cross-section of the tube, which wouldn't be ideal. The ultimate solution I came up with was to use these things, which are called cross dowels. These go inside the tube and their round shape keeps them from spinning as they're being tightened. I fed each cross dowel in from the open ends of each side of the frame tube, and then I used a stack of strong magnets to properly position them over top of each hole. To help the machine screws easily find the threads in the cross dowel, I tapered the ends of each screw. Admittedly, getting these screws in place was a tricky and time-consuming process, but they seem to make a strong connection, and it's not something that I see myself needing to disassemble and reassemble in the future. So here you can see the fully reassembled seat, which I also took the opportunity to cover with metallic gold paint to match the rest of the bike. I also replaced the foam which goes underneath the seat here, and I used foam which came from one of these foam knee saver pads. I have no idea what the original foam which is actually supposed to be installed in there looks like, but when I bought the bike, it had this very soft mattress foam stuffed in there, which I found is just too soft, and I find this more dense stuff works a lot better. So with the frame and the seat repaired, I was finally able to ride this bike again, and it was a real pleasure. Another change which I made to the bike when I was reassembling it was replacing all of the quick releases on the frame with standard nuts and bolts. If these aren't adequately tightened, then the frame will make a creaking sound while riding, and with quick releases I always found it tricky making them really tight. Since I rarely see myself needing to fold the bike, this has been a good improvement. I've also made some recent upgrades to the under-seat steering. To give a better view of this, I'll fold the seat out of the way. The handlebars are designed to pivot on a bolt, which is threaded into the steering block on the frame. When I first got the bike, the handlebars had a lot of play in them. So I tried tightening the bolt, but I found that it was bottoming out in the hole that it was going into, so instead I tried adding an extra spacer instead. With that gap filled by this extra spacer, however, when I'd be riding the bike and turning the handlebars, sometimes the friction from the handlebars would get transferred to the bolt, which would cause it to unscrew itself, and then I'd be back to having floppy handlebars again. After I saw how this had been addressed on my newer Linear, I decided to adopt the same solution here. First of all, I added thrust bearings, which go above and below the handlebars. These allow strong pressure to be applied by the bolts, but minimal friction when turning the handlebars. Even with the reduced friction, to ensure that the bolt can't get unscrewed, I added this set screw here, which is tightened using an Allen key, and that presses into the bolts and locks it in place. I've been told that Loctite would also be sufficient for this, but I decided to go with the set screw because it means it'll be a lot easier if I ever have to make any adjustments to it in the future. I'm extremely satisfied with these upgrades to the steering, and if you have an Iowa Linear with floppy handlebars, I strongly encourage you to do the same. The final upgrade that I've made to the bike were these things, which are called cable stops. The bike came with these painted steel ones, which as you can see are starting to rust. However, the thing about them that I couldn't stand was that since they have a hole for the cable rather than a slot, it meant that you needed to fully unthread the cable anytime you wanted to remove it. This made simple maintenance tasks on the bike really annoying. I was able to find these replacement cable stops online, which are very similar to the ones on my newer Linear, and as you can see, it's very easy to disassemble for doing maintenance. Just like the old ones, these are held in place using pop rivets. So as you can see in my quest to rebuild this bike, I've taken some of Linear's innovations and applied them to further improve it. So there are still a few remaining improvements that I want to make to this bike, and I plan on sharing those in future videos. Since I bought this bike, I was never very happy with the brakes which came on it, so I bought these new brakes which I'll be installing. I'm also planning on installing a milk crate on this bike, which is a task I've shown before in other videos. However, this time when I install it, I'm going to show a new method which I use, which makes it so that the milk crate is easily removable, and yet it's still also very securely fastened. I've also ordered a different set of cranks for this bike, but they haven't arrived yet. There's nothing wrong with these cranks, but I'm finding that I get sore knees when I'm riding this bike, which is the problem that I solved on my other Linear by getting cranks which are a bit shorter. So stay tuned to my YouTube channel to see those future upgrades to this bike. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll look forward to reading your comments in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.